I started my weightlifting journey back in 2020 and got really heavily invested in it in 2022. And if you're like me, you started to notice on your weightlifting journey that your hair may be thinning. And on diving into Reddit communities, I inevitably found dozens of other men well on their way in their weightlifting journeys also experiencing the significant hair loss. So then the question becomes, does weightlifting cause hair loss? Well, let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton. And as you heard in the intro, today we are going to be talking about exercise, weightlifting specifically, and hair loss. So, ladies and gentlemen, go grab yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and let's jump right into today's episode of The Science Behind That. So, exercise and hair loss. This is a topic that, unfortunately, I have a lot of experience with, because this is something I've dealt with myself. I started my whole fitness journey about 4 years ago in 2020, but I didn't start, dedicatedly weightlifting 5 days a week, every week until 2022. And it was right about 2022 that I started to notice a less awesome side effect of weightlifting. I mean, the one side effect that I was seeing was obviously gaining muscle mass and developing a physique that I was happy with, which is great. And there were a lot of other benefits too, increased endurance, etc. But one thing I was noticing was that my hair was thinning significantly. And that was just 2.5 years ago. Fast forward to now, and unfortunately, my hair is thinned very, very significantly. And it always made me wonder, is there any science behind saying that weightlifting can contribute to hair loss? And that's kind of what led me to this episode. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about first what hair is, how it grows, how that works. And then from there, we're going to be talking very basically what are the conditions in which exercise can directly contribute to hair loss. And then we're also going to be talking about what hormones are produced that can influence hair thinning and hair growth. And then finally, we're going to be talking about supplements effects and putting it all together. Does weightlifting cause hair loss? So we're going to jump right into that. Sorry, I had to take a sip of coffee there. We're going to jump right into that now. So starting off, what is hair? Well, hair is, it's basically a vestigial structure from when humans had fur. And it's not a true vestigial structure because a true vestigial structure doesn't have a purpose. Hair does still serve a purpose. It keeps dust off of our skin. It's responsible for cleaning, protecting our eyes. To a lesser extent, keeping us warm, but it really protects our skin from UV damage. But the biology of how hair grows on the body versus the scalp versus the face is slightly different. But for today's episode, we're just going to be focusing on the scalp. But ultimately, hair is composed of the same thing. You have your hair shaft, which goes into the skin and connects into the follicle. And the follicle, it goes through the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutis. And the follicle is composed of the hair bulb, which is basically, this bit of tissue. It's like the root of the hair. And then the root of the hair is nourished by the hair papilla, which includes nerves and blood vessels. And then the follicle itself is attached to a small, smooth muscle called the erector pili muscle. And this is responsible for like your hairs standing up on edge when you're cold or when you're nervous, goosebumps. That's the erector pili muscle. And then more towards the top of the hair follicle, you have your sebaceous gland. So, that's basically what hair looks like. And that hair follicle is important because that hair follicle is obviously where the root of the hair shaft attaches, but it's also what nourishes the hair. And it's what keeps it alive, basically, what keeps it full. And these hair follicles can change in size. And oftentimes, what we see is in thinning hair, the hair follicle gets smaller and smaller and smaller until there's no more nourishing aspect of it to the hair shaft, and then the hair falls out. And then, if the person has androgenic alopecia, a lot of times too, after the hair falls out, new skin will grow over the top of that follicle, so no new hair will grow from there again. But ultimately, hair growth occurs in 4 phases. Anagen, which is the growth phase, catagen, which is this transitional phase between growth and resting, telogen, which is the resting phase, and exogen, which is the shedding phase. So, just as their names imply, anagen is when the hair is actually growing, and this can occur for many years. Catagen is a transitional period with the individual hair follicles where they go from a state of active growth to a state of non-active growth, i.e. telogen. And then exogen obviously is when the hair follicle decreases in size and the hair falls out. And ultimately, that's how that works. And so as new healthy hair cells are produced, it pushes up on the old ones, which results in the hair growing longer, right? So that's how hair grows. And so going along with that, are there situations in which exercise can cause hair loss? There are certain circumstances. So in circumstances of a person is over exercising and is not getting nearly enough nutrition, this can cause hair loss. And it causes hair loss in a form called telogen effluvium. And what telogen effluvium is it's a form of non-scarring alopecia that's characterized by diffuse shedding of hair. And so in this type of hair loss, you don't see male pattern baldness, right? It's just hair all over is falling out. And oftentimes the big component of this is nutritional deficiencies, especially iron. And so if somebody's over exercising, it means that they're using a lot of energy, they're expelling a lot of nutrients through their sweat, and they really need to replace those nutrients. But if they're not getting proper nutrition as a result of that, what's the first thing to go? Their hair. So that situation can cause hair loss. And then another situation is just simply if somebody exercises a lot, and they don't wash the sweat out of their scalp afterwards, that can build up and it can create a stressful oxidative environment for the hair follicle itself, to where we see that decrease in hair follicle size. And then, so those are the most direct ways, but even then, exercise in those situations is not directly causing hair loss. Now, there are some very rudimentary preliminary studies that suggest that potentially during exercise you have an increase of oxidative stress, which could result in a decrease of follicular size, again resulting in shedding, or the progression to the exogen phase, right? But those studies are very rudimentary and they've offered mixed results. So then to recap before we head into this next section here, we know how hair works, right? And the process of hair growth versus hair shedding is basically all dependent on the health of the hair follicle that the hair shaft is rooted into, right? Because if the follicle is healthy, it's getting blood and nourishment, it won't fall out. And we know that hair loss is a decreasing of that follicle size, resulting in eventually the hair not getting any nutrients and it falls out. So then the question becomes, well, weightlifting causes transient increases in testosterone. Does testosterone have an impact on hair growth? Testosterone doesn't. Testosterone in its raw form does not have an impact on hair growth. However, a similar androgenic form of testosterone called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT, has been shown to be very much involved in the process of going into the exogen phase. Now, how does that work? Well, especially in individuals that have genetic predispositions for androgenic alopecia, hair follicles become highly sensitive to DHT. So in these people, if let's say you have a person named Bob, right? If Bob doesn't know that he has this genetic predisposition, he begins a weightlifting routine and whatnot. If he has androgenic alopecia, the higher Bob's DHT levels become, the more his hair follicles on his head are going to shrink and eventually fall out. That being said, though, weightlifting does not necessarily cause a chronic increase of DHT. It causes transient increases of DHT. However, over very, very long periods of time, right? If you're on a weightlifting routine for, 5, 10, 15 years, it does result in a higher baseline level of testosterone and DHT. But even still, this isn't necessarily enough to cause hair loss directly. But ultimately, the higher DHT levels a person has, the more significant shrinkage they see in their hair follicle size. And eventually, if that continues long enough, it can cause complete hair loss, especially in a form of male pattern balding hair loss. So then, you're sitting there listening to this episode thinking, okay, so exercise doesn't necessarily correlate to hair loss, right? That while it causes transient increases of serum DHT levels, but not necessarily enough to result in significant male pattern baldness. Which you would be accurate if that's the summary you got. However, certain supplements can cause elevated DHT levels. And what I was surprised to realize or to learn is that creatine causes significant increases of DHT, which makes sense. We've talked about creatine before on this show, and creatine is often taken as a health supplement by fitness fanatics like myself, because it increases muscle size, it increases muscle strength, and we've seen this, right? Creatine increases muscle size through accelerating the shuttling of water and nutrients into the muscle body, but it also increases muscle strength because it upregulates DHT production. And DHT is an androgen, the same as regular testosterone, and DHT causes significant increases in muscle hypertrophy and strength through transcriptional regulation. But in many, many studies in the Clinical Journal of Sports Medicine and others, the Clinical Journal of Physiology and Endocrinology, research has demonstrated that creatine doesn't affect testosterone levels. However, creatine as administered of 25 grams of creatine per day for 7 days increases DHT levels by 56% just after those 7 days of loading. And then after 7 days of 14 days of maintenance, those DHT levels remained at or above 40% elevation, which is significant. Creatine upregulates the production of DHT by up to 56%, and DHT does three things. It increases muscle strength capacity, it increases hypertrophy, and of course, DHT, especially in individuals with genetic predispositions for hair loss, can cause hair loss. So, the data would suggest that it's not so much the weightlifting that causes the hair loss. It's the combination of weightlifting with creatine with genetic predispositions for male pattern balding. Because in those individuals with those genetic predispositions, it appears that their hair follicles are hypersensitive to serum DHT levels. So ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, no, weightlifting does not directly cause hair loss. However, things like creatine, things like dedicated weightlifting, things like higher DHT levels, and genetic predispositions can increase the risk of male pattern baldness following an exercise routine. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, as somebody who is going through that right now, I think the positive effects of weightlifting and taking creatine and whatnot far outweigh the negative effect of losing my hair. So I hope all of you guys enjoyed this episode. It was fun for me to make. It really was, because it's been something that, I've been thinking about for a long time. And I hope that you guys learned something. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, have a fantastic weekend. It's Friday. Enjoy the weekend. And remember, as always, stand up and question everything. I'll see y'all on Monday.